Hello everyone, my name is Dan Rodney and welcome to Noble Desktop's live stream for Intro to Adobe Illustrator. Today we're going to be starting you off from the beginning, getting started with Adobe Illustrator. We're not presuming any sort of prior experience. It's okay if you have some experience. I'm sure you'll still pick up some tips and tricks, but this is an introduction, so it's meant for people that have little to no experience with Adobe Illustrator. So if you're an Adobe Illustrator expert, this is probably not the seminar or live stream for you. So my name is Dan Rodney, and I'm an instructor at Noble Desktop, and I do course development and instructing there. I'm a graphic designer and as well as a web developer as well. And if you're not familiar with Noble Desktop, for the past 26 years, we've been training people based here in New York City. That's where I am right now. And we teach people all sorts of design software and web design. So from coding HTML, CSS, JavaScript to Adobe apps. I'm an Adobe certified expert. Noble Desktop is an Adobe certified training center. And so we teach Illustrator, Photoshop, InDesign, After Effects, and a good variety of Adobe programs. So for those of you who are attending live, I do have a second monitor where I try to keep an eye on the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat as we go through. I will have a Q&A at the end as well. If I miss your question or if you just want to hold a question towards the end, that's fine. For all of you who are attending live, you'll get an email with a link to watch this later if you want to watch the recording, and this will also be posted to our YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can find out about future videos that we post. Anything that we live stream, we record it and we post it to our YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All right. So shortly I'm going to switch over to do a screen share, but one more thing before we get started. So we do train people in these types of software here in New York City, or you can take our classes live online as well. So these seminars are just a demonstration. They're not hands-on like our typical classes. The typical classes that people take here in New York City, or if they're doing a live online version, they attend live and see the instructor's computer, and those are hands-on. We write workbooks that we give out for those classes, and you can also buy those workbooks separately. It's mentioned here beside me, talking about our workbooks, and those are great step-by-step ways to learn more if you do want to learn more. But that said, let's go ahead and get started. I want to show you Illustrator. Now, just a couple things before we get started with the demonstration. I'm going to be showing Illustrator CC 2017 just because it is the latest version. I'm not concentrating on new features by any means. I'm just going to show the latest version of Illustrator because it's the latest version. If you're using a much older version like CS6 or older, there will be some things that are not available to you. Most of the fundamentals, though, that I'm showing today work across many versions of Illustrator, so most of the features don't require the latest version. There are a few things that are easier now in CC 2017, so if you have the Creative Cloud version, be sure to upgrade. There are some nice new things that make it a little bit easier to get started. But fundamentally, most of the things that I'm showing today have been around in Illustrator for quite some time, and the fundamentals are core fundamentals that don't really change across versions. That said, we're going to try to make Illustrator as approachable as possible, but there are some parts of Illustrator that aren't necessarily the most intuitive. I often say that Illustrator is easy in some ways, but it's hard to approach sometimes. That once you know how to do something, it might not be hard to do something. It might be pretty easy to do something in Illustrator, but it might not have been intuitive to figure out for some of those things. I remember when I first learned Illustrator, it was actually the first design software that I used. So when I got to the other apps, they just seemed really easy because I had already learned on what I consider kind of the hardest of the three kind of main InDesign apps for like InDesign, Illustrator, Photoshop. I think that InDesign and Photoshop are more approachable and a bit more intuitive for new users, and Illustrator can be a little bit daunting because there are often particular ways that Illustrator wants you to work. And once you know how to do things, like I said, it might not be hard to do something, it just might not have been initially completely intuitive to figure those things out. So hopefully today we're going to make it easier for you to get started with Illustrator and break down some of those walls. And also, as we get to drawing, some things are just going to require practice. That just like drawing in real life, this is a drawing program. So some things, the more you draw, the better you get. There's just some things that practice is what makes you perfect. So I'm going to switch over here to do my screen share. There we go. So you should be able to see my screen now. And all right. So actually, the first thing I'm going to do is just open up two demonstration files here. One in Photoshop and one in Illustrator. Now, normally you would not create the same element twice, that kind of the same drawing twice in two different programs, but I want to show you the difference between Illustrator and Photoshop, just so we're clear about when you should use one versus the other. There's definitely overlap between the two, but sometimes there's clear right and wrongs as to which program you should be choosing. So fundamentally, the big difference between Illustrator and Photoshop is that Illustrator is what we call a vector program, and vectors are these beautifully crisp, clean, mathematically described lines that have infinite quality. So in this illustration here that I have in Illustrator, as I use my zoom tool to zoom in, I'm going to just drag on my screen. As I drag left and right, I can zoom in and out on my screen. If you're using an older version of Illustrator, you'll have to drag a box over the thing you want to see and it will zoom in. But in the newer versions, if you have a supported video card, you can actually just drag to the right or drag to the left to zoom in. So I'm going to zoom in, and as I zoom in and I zoom in and I zoom in, it's always looking crisp and clean and beautiful, no matter how far I zoom in. And newer versions of Illustrator can zoom in farther. I think it used to be 6,400%. Now it's 64,000%. I forget what the exact one used to be, but I know now you can zoom in farther. Sorry, I forgot to turn off that music again. Yep. Always forget to turn that music off. Sorry about that. Okay. So the primary difference, as I was saying, is that Illustrator is vector and Photoshop is pixel-based. And so in Illustrator, as you zoom in and you zoom in and you zoom in, you are always pixel perfect, beautiful, crisp and clean. No matter what resolution you print this, it's always going to look great. That's different than Photoshop, though. In Photoshop, Photoshop is limited to pixels. Photoshop is made up of square blocks. As you zoom in, you're going to see all those pixels. And so pixels have a specific resolution. And if I go into image size, you can see here there's 500 by 500 pixels. And if we look at this in terms of inches, at 72 pixels per inch, this would print at almost 7 inches. But 72 pixels per inch, the pixels are still fairly large, and you're going to see those. So if I change this, for example, to 300 pixels per inch, the pixels are much smaller. I have the same number of pixels, but I have shrunk them down, so they're much smaller. Now, instead of printing almost 7 inches, it's 1.6 inches, so it's really small, but it's very high quality now. It's going to look nice at that small size. So you can print something any size you want. You can print it at 10 inches by 10 inches, but that doesn't mean it's going to look good. It's only going to be 50 pixels per inch, and that means those pixels are going to be big enough that you're actually going to see them when they print, at least if you're looking at that print pretty close up. So pixels always have this resolution, this certain number of pixels per inch. And that's why with digital cameras, we have to buy a digital camera with enough pixels so that we're capturing a lot of detail, because we don't want to have low resolution and when we look at our images, see these kind of larger pixels. So Photoshop is good for pixel-based art, but it's not so great for drawing. The real advantage to Adobe Illustrator here is that when we draw things, it's actually made of these lines. I'm going to switch over for a moment into outline mode. Behind the scenes, really everything is broken down into lines, these paths. They call them Bezier curves or vector paths. And so when these lines are drawn, they're mathematically described behind the scenes. Now, we don't have to know the math to do this, but behind the scenes, they're stored as kind of mathematical points in a certain space, and so they're not really rendered as pixels until they're on screen. Or when you print, it's going to print at the full pixel resolution of whatever the resolution of your printer is. It's going to render as many pixels as possible. So the pixels are just rendered for something, for a print or for a screen. And so when we're drawing, we don't have to worry about how many pixels per inch for our drawing. And it just means that we can make things as big as we want, and it will print or be visible at full quality. And that's great. If you're making a web page and you want to make an icon bigger, if you have a vector version of the icon, you can make it bigger or smaller. You don't have to worry about it being blown up and looking poor, whether it's in a web page or in printout. And so that's the advantage. So Illustrator is better for vector type of artwork, this kind of flat, solid type of artwork. Of course, if we're doing photos, Photoshop is good for that. If you're going to take pictures on your camera is going to output a pixel-based piece of artwork. So Illustrator is good for logos, drawings, icons. A lot of people do packaging in it. They do fashion design. If you're doing pattern work, they often use Illustrator for that. So there's lots of varieties of uses for Illustrator, but especially things that are graphic and crisp and clean and illustrated, drawn, then Illustrator is great for those types of things. Okay, so that's it. That's what we want to be using Illustrator for. Let's start a file here. So we can go to File, New, or we can click the New button here and get started. In the very latest version of Illustrator, CC 2017, which just came out recently, they redesigned this new dialog, but fundamentally the settings are still the same as they used to be. This just aesthetically looks different. There used to be a menu for mobile versus print, whereas now there are tabs across the top. There used to be a menu for the presets, whereas now they're icons, but you still should have pretty similar presets in your older version that just aesthetically looks different. I'm just going to start off with a basic file here. Let's just choose a letter page and click OK for now. We'll come back and talk more about this, but I just want to have a page that I can start to do some stuff on. It's not so important right now, the size of my page. All right, and I'll close this little message about Adobe stock. I don't want to get into that right now. All right, so let's get into some basic tools and navigating around our document. So over here we have our toolbar. This toolbar may be collapsed into one column or expanded into two columns. So depending on how you have your Illustrator set up, it may be one or two columns. The screen that I'm on right now, it doesn't fit in one column. Some of the stuff gets cut off, so I'm going to be in the two column so that I can see all of my tools. All right, now a couple things about these tools. If you click and hold, you get access to hidden related tools. So anything that has a little triangle next to it, that means that there's some hidden tools, and you can click and hold to choose those hidden tools. If there is no little triangle at the bottom right, like this tool, there's nothing hidden behind it. So I'm going to click on this rectangle tool here and come out here and draw out a rectangle. And we can draw multiple rectangles, and if you notice as I'm drawing these that they're kind of piling on top of one another. By default they are white with a black fill. We can choose other shapes such as an ellipse. I can draw that, and we're just dragging on the screen here to create those other shapes. Now once you've drawn those shapes, we have to be able to move them around and delete them and rearrange them and choose settings. So whenever you're in one of these drawing tools, the only purpose of this tool is to really draw. So it's going to keep creating things. If you want to select things, you have to go back to one of the arrows or selection tools. They're not actually quite so much arrows as they are pointers now. A lot of people still call these the black and white arrow, and I might still call these the black and the white arrow, just because they used to literally be black and white arrows. Now they're kind of arrows, but they're kind of like more pointers. But these are the selection and direct selection tools. We'll come back to the direct selection later. I'm going to start with the main selection tool. So whether you call this the black arrow or just the selection tool, this is how you can move things around on your page. You can click on something and hit your delete key to get rid of it. You can resize those elements as well, like so. Now, let's say we want to zoom in. We've got a zoom tool. And again, if you're in the newer version of Illustrator, you can drag to the right or to the left to zoom in. Or if you're on an older version of Illustrator, you can drag a box over the thing you want to see, and when you release, it'll zoom in to that. If you ever want to go back and see the whole screen, you can go to View and say Fit Artboard in Window, and you'll be able to see the whole page once again. I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit more. Now, once you're zoomed in, to be able to navigate around, you can use your scroll bars. But what I find is that there's a huge workspace and only very only the very center of it actually has your artboards. So it's kind of difficult to use your scroll bars to scroll around because it's such a small little area that you're actually going to be scrolling within. It's much more efficient to use the hand tool. So we come over here to the hand tool and we can drag around anywhere on the document, and we'll just be moving around to see a different part of it. You can also go diagonally, and so it's just more efficient to be able to move around using this hand tool. As far as keyboard shortcuts go, there are a couple keyboard shortcuts that make navigating your document a bit easier, so that let's say you're drawing a rectangle here and you want to zoom in or out. In all Adobe apps, you can hit Command plus or Command minus. On Windows, that would be Control plus and Control minus, and that will zoom in and out. If you want to move around the page, hold your space bar, and when you're holding your space bar, you can drag anywhere with the hand tool. So holding that space bar gives you access to the hand tool without actually switching to the hand tool, which is nice. So just hold space, drag around, let go. You're still in the rectangle tool that you were in just a moment ago. You didn't actually have to come over to the toolbar and select the tool, and when you were done, go back to the tool that you were in. For a lot of keyboard shortcuts like that that can speed up your workflow, we have on our website, nobledesktop.com, some goodies. If you go over here to keyboard shortcuts, you can find keyboard shortcut guides for the various different versions of Illustrator. We'll be posting the CC 2017 very soon, but it's basically like the 2015, so you can download this and it's still going to give you most of the same keyboard shortcuts. I don't know actually if they even really changed any for 2017. But we're going to click on, let's say, Window or Mac. You can get either one. And while they are here on the page that you can search, the great thing is to download this single page PDF. And this is a nice printable page. Keep it next to your desk as you're learning Illustrator. And it just has a bunch of the great keyboard shortcuts that you might not find anywhere in a menu. They're just ones you'd have to know. And we've documented them all here for you. So it's a great free reference for you. And we have them for all the Adobe apps. All right, so one small thing about Illustrator CC 2017, as I do the keyboard shortcut for zooming in and out, the Command plus, the Command minus. On Windows, that would be Control plus and Control minus. The latest version does zoom towards what you have selected. In previous versions, it just zoomed in on the center of your screen. So now that you're in 2017, if you've upgraded to that, if you want to zoom in on something, actually select that something and then hit the Command plus or the Command minus. If you don't have anything selected, then it will just zoom in on the center of the screen like it used to in older versions of it. Okay, so as we're drawing, let me just delete all these guys here. So as we're drawing with these basic shapes, normally they are a rectangle or they are an ellipse. But if we want to make a perfect version of those, a perfect circle or a perfect rectangle, hold Shift as you draw. So if I don't hold Shift, it's going to be any width and height that I want. If I hold Shift, then it will be a perfect same width and height circle, perfect square, same width and height, like so. So just hold Shift as you draw. Okay. Another way that you can also draw with these tools is you can draw precisely. So instead of dragging out and just eyeballing how big you want something to be, if you want to be more precise, let me hit delete, you can just click anywhere on your page. You want to click where you want to place that particular item, and you can give it a width and a height. Now right now my document is in points. That's because when I created my document, I went to File, New, and when I chose my document here, over here this little menu said points. If I want to use inches, I can choose that here, and then the document will be created in inches. So now when I click, we'll see inches. But something that's good to know about all the Adobe programs is that you can typically type in whatever measurement you want. So if you want to do this in inches, fine. You can say 2 by 4, and it'll create that precise size. But also, let's say you want to keep your document inches, but this one thing needs to be 100 millimeters by 200 millimeters. Notice that as I type in millimeters, when I click into the other field, it automatically converts that into inches. All right. So, but you can change your document preferences after the fact. The easiest way to do that, in my opinion, is to go into the rulers, show rulers, and then you can right-click or control-click on the rulers, and you can see what your current measurement type is. And you can do this on the top ruler or the left ruler. Just control-click if you're on a Mac, or right-click on Mac or PC, and you can switch. So if you want to be in millimeters, and there you're in millimeters. And so now the ruler is in that, but also when I go to create precise shapes, we see that my document's now in millimeters. I do want to switch back to inches, so I'm going to right-click or control-click on the ruler and say inches, and now my document is back to being inches. Okay. Let's close this other file, which we don't need. All right. Now, there's other shapes here that we can do, such as a rounded rectangle. We could do a rounded rectangle here. Once you're done drawing the rounded rectangle, you can go back to your selection tool to move it around, to resize it, but also to change how rounded the corners are. So there's a few resize handles and little widgets around here that we need to talk about. If you go to the outer resize widget here, this little box, then you can resize both width and height if you grab the corner. If you grab one of the sides, you just do either the width or the height. The middle point here is just for moving. They just want to show where the center point is. That's not really for doing something other than just moving it around. But these circles that are here, you can drag over that circle and change how rounded the corners are. So that's kind of nice. If you wanted to be more precise about that, again, when you initially draw the rounded rectangle, instead of dragging it out, you can click. And if you want to be very precise over a specific amount, you can type in a specific corner radius. Notice that you have a new option here. Other than just width and height, you have corner radius. And that way you could make a bunch of different ones that are exactly maybe the same corner radius, but different dimensions. You can also change any of those things in the transform panel. So there's panels over here that you can adjust and hide and show. And they show this libraries panel by default, which that's for adding assets that you want to frequently reuse. And we're not going to really get into that today. I think it's kind of silly to show that huge like that. So I would personally just go in and close this particular panel. Now, a couple things about how to work with these panels. This little menu right here is more options relating to that particular panel. So if you're in one of these other panels that you can pop open by clicking these icons, you can go into that menu right there, and you can see different options for that particular panel. If the panel is expanded like it is here, you're going to see the panel options, but you can click on the button over here. These buttons are collapsed, and so you're only going to see one of these. You can collapse any section here by clicking these little double arrow up here, and you can collapse it down to an icon and see how you can kind of pop that open and closed if you want to. So any of these sections you can kind of expand or collapse. So I could actually expand this, and then I could see all of those different panels. If you want to close any particular panel, go to the tab and control click or right click, and then you can close that. So if you don't want a particular panel, you can control click or right click and close that. If you want to get rid of all the panels in that group, you would do the close tab group. Okay. So transform panel. So there are some default panels over here on the right, but there's a lot more panels that you might need to open up, and those are all under the window menu. They're all alphabetically listed, and so I want to go to the transform panel. I can choose that. Now in this case, this one wasn't docked over on the right hand side, so it's a floating panel. But now I can select something and I can see the options for that. And I can numerically put in exactly how much I want for the corners. And if I unlink it, I can change individual corners like so. What's nice about these type of rounded corners is even as I resize my object, the rounded corners do not get distorted. This is different than it was in older versions of Illustrator, where you didn't have individual control over corners, and the rounded rectangle tool wasn't very good because it hard drew in the rounding. You couldn't change how round it was after the fact. You couldn't individually control corners. So in older versions of Illustrator, I wasn't especially fond of the rounded rectangle tool. It wasn't especially great. Okay, so that is new and improved in the Creative Cloud version of Illustrator. All right, so a couple things about panels. If you want to rearrange and organize things, you can drag either the whole group by dragging the top bar there, or just the one. Let's say you actually want all of these, because I'm going to come back to the Pathfinder panel later. I want to dock that over here. So I'm going to drag that over here, and you can kind of put it into one of these sections wherever you want to put it. And then there it's going to be available. Any of the panels that get collapsed, you can click on the tab to show it, and you can double click on another tab to kind of expand or collapse. Some of them can be smaller or bigger. So as you double click, it kind of goes through all of the expanded or collapsed states that particular panel can go through. So for example, the color panel, if I double click on it, it closes, but if I double click it again, notice it shows more options. Let me double click it again. See how it's just the color ramp now? If I double click it, it closes, double click it, it opens up. That's also this little arrow, double arrow right there. You can also just single click that to quickly go through expanded to collapsed for the different ones there. Okay. So other shapes. We've got polygon, for example. As we do the polygon, the transform panel will let you change the number of sides. But we can also do this on the fly as we draw, which in previous versions of Illustrator that didn't have this transform panel properties, this is how we'd have to do this. But it's kind of a shortcut if you know better. As we draw the polygon, while we're holding down the mouse, we can use our up and down arrow keys to change the number of sides. So I just hit up arrow to increase the number of sides, down arrow to decrease the number of sides. And that trick is useful in lots of different drawing tools. For example, the rounded rectangle. As I draw a rounded rectangle, if I want to visually change the size of the rounding while I'm drawing, I can hit my up arrow or my down arrow, and I change how rounded it is. We can do the same type of thing in the star tool. When I draw out a star, I can use my up arrow or down arrow to change the number of points. Unlike the other shapes, the star tool is not currently what's considered a live shape. Things like the polygon are a live shape, and by live we mean that we can change different settings, that the number of sides is a live attribute. With a star, the number of points is not a live attribute that I can just change. If I want to change the number of points, I basically just need to recreate a new star. So that's why that trick of using the up and down arrows is quite nice. So you drag out with the star tool, up arrow or down arrow. Now you might want to make the star pointier or less pointy. So another trick, again, while I'm holding the mouse down, once I let go, it's done. I can't edit the shape. So I'm going to delete it. So you have to do this all while you're drawing. On the Mac, you hold Command, or on Windows, you hold Control, and you can drag out how pointy these are. So that's pretty neat because you could do something very pointy, and then the next star is going to look exactly the same way unless you go in and you start to do something different. Okay, let's delete those. So you might want to do a star like that, or let me hold Command on the Mac or Control and drag in. Again, I can't let go of the mouse as I do this. Now I can hit my up arrow many, many times. And maybe now I want to get like a little sticker that has kind of like a serrated edge kind of feel. Again, I can hold the Command key and I can make those kind of serrated edges, if you will, smaller or bigger as I'm doing that. Cool. Now, all of that can be done numerically speaking by clicking, and there's an inner radius and an outer radius. If there's not much of a difference, you're not going to have a big pointy point on your star. So for example, if you do 0.9 and 0.8 with 40 points, there's not much of a difference. It's not very pointy. If you make it 3 inches and then 0.8 inches, that's a big difference, and then you're going to get something very pointy. That would probably be more appropriate if I only had 6 points on that, something like that. But it's so much easier, instead of typing out values, to do your Command drag on Mac, Control drag on PC, or up and down arrows to change the number of points because you're visually doing it. Especially since this is not a live shape that you can change after, you have to get it right from the beginning, or I should say it's easiest to get it right from the beginning. There are some ways you can edit some of those things after the fact. So just some cool little tips and tricks for that. Now, those are shapes. If you want to draw lines, there are line tools as well. So for example, the line segment is just a straight line. Every time you use that, you draw a straight line. If you want to draw a curved line, you've got the arc tool that you can draw. Once again, the up and down arrows let you change the kind of arc that you're getting between those. So that's a cool thing, is once you know that trick, you just kind of try the up and down arrows for any of those. It's pretty cool. They also use it, for example, for the spiral tool. Up and down arrows increase the depth of the spiral. And command, which we used on the star, that changes how quickly it curls into the spiral. The rectangle grid tool, up and down arrows. This also has left and right arrows as well. So it's kind of cool to be able to do these things visually as you draw. And a lot of people don't know that, actually. And I think it really helps out new people to know that that you can adjust these things on the fly as you do it, because it's kind of nice to be able to visually do it while you're drawing. So again, that's one of those things. It's not intuitive that you would have just known to do that, but once you know it, that's kind of cool. It makes Illustrator a lot more approachable and a lot easier. So, alrighty, let's go back. Okay, we've been doing very basic shapes here with white and black strokes. Let's get into color here. There are icons here on the left in the toolbar, and the same icons here in the color panel. We'll do the one here in the toolbar because it's bigger. There's a fill in front, and right now a stroke behind. If I click on stroke and that comes to the front, the one that's in front is the fill color or the stroke color that you're going to be changing. So which one do you want to change? I want to change the fill right now. So I'm going to go to fill, click on that. There's a red slash, which means none. There's no fill, and I want to change the color. Now I could double click on that color to get the color picker, and I could choose a color this way, or I could go and just drag through this color ramp over here in the color panel and choose a color that way. I can also numerically dial in a specific color here using the CMYK values. Right now I'm seeing CMYK values because I chose that this is a print document, so I'm seeing CMYK values. If I go to File, New, and I were to choose a web document, this is going to be created as RGB colors, because anything for on-screen or video, we mix up colors as red, green, and blue, RGB, and anything for print, we're mixing up colors as CMYK. Now, when you come in here, I came back to my CMYK document, as indicated up here in my tab, but notice the color picker is RGB now. That was curious, because just a moment ago, it was CMYK. Why did it get switched? Well, you can input colors in a variety of different methods. And this kind of got stuck on RGB because I was just in an RGB document. But that just makes us need to know that we need to go over here into this little menu and see we can switch the color picker. Even though you're in a CMYK document, you can input the colors in whatever method you want. So if you want to print a color that somebody used on a web page, you might input that as a hex value if your web coder gives that to you. Or they might give you an RGB value that you can input, and it's going to be converted into a CMYK color because you're in a CMYK document. But you can input it in whatever method you want. And then you just switch to CMYK to see what the CMYK equivalent of that color is. Okay. Let's go and create some other shapes here on top of this. So I'll create a red. Now, all of these shapes right now have a black outline around them, as Illustrator calls a stroke. So I'm going to select both of these. And because they have two different fills, I'm seeing a question mark for the fill, but I am showing a common black stroke. So I can click on the stroke. And if I want to get rid of that, right down here, there are a few shortcuts just to get to like solid color or gradient or none. So I can just click on none here. Or if I'd rather do that over here in the color panel, there's also a none there as well. I can click on that to get rid of the stroke color. Now it's just the filled objects. Let's create another shape, such as a star. That one I'm going to click on the fill. So whatever color's in front, That's the color you're going to be assigning at the moment. Because you're choosing one color, it has to go somewhere. Let's just say I choose a dark blue. And then let's say I go to the stroke and choose a yellow stroke for that. Maybe now I want to make the stroke thicker. I see down here a stroke panel that I can click on, and I can make that stroke thicker. But sometimes you don't need to use the panels that are over here on the right. There are a bunch of panels, and they do show all sorts of options, but up here at the top of the screen is an options bar. Now this options bar shows just kind of the most relevant options for you at a glance, so you might not have to be continuing to open and close a bunch of different panels. For example, you've got your stroke weight right here. I wouldn't even need to worry about opening up the stroke panel. I can also click on fill, and initially they give me the swatches list, so I can choose between the pre-made swatches here in Illustrator. These are all given to me by creating a new file. They just pre-fill out the swatches with a few different swatches. If I mouse over this, it does say hold shift key to bring up alternate color UI, which is user interface. I would have said hold shift to show the other color picker, something like that. So if I hold shift when I click, then I get the color picker where I can input my own color. So a normal click is the swatches, but a shift click is the color picker that you see over here in the color panel. It's the same thing. I can choose a color, whatever color I want. I can go over here to the stroke, shift click on that, and choose a color that I want for the stroke. Now let's say that you like the colors you've chosen, but you decided, I want to flip-flop the stroke and the fill. I want a yellow fill and a blue stroke. Right over here is an arrow. This bended arrow right here will swap your fill and your stroke. You click it, and it flops those two. In the case of this object, if I flip-flop those, then it means I have no fill and I only have a stroke. Let's go make that stroke bigger. And now we can see through that filled object. So it's really just a ring with an empty fill inside of it. Alrighty. Now, there's definitely a front to back order going on here. The green's in back, the red ring is on top and of that, and then the star is on top of that. That's the order that I drew these things in. If I draw another thing on top of this, let's say a rectangle that covers over everything, it literally is going to cover over everything. If I just draw it on the right-hand side here, I only cover whatever it's on top of, but it's in front of all that stuff. So let's say I want to rearrange these objects. There's a few ways you can do that. Under Object, Arrange, you can use Send to Back to go all the way to the back. But what if I only want to go back behind the red ring and not behind the green object? I can send Backward, which goes one step back, but not all the way to the back. Now, if you have a lot of objects, that can be very tedious to keep bringing something forward one step or sending something backward one step. So if you want to go all the way, send to back goes all the way, or bring to front comes all the way once again. Now, when you do send to back, initially you can still see the blue outline, but once you click off, you don't see that anymore. So that's just kind of telling you where your object is and kind of what it looks like. Even though you can't see behind it, you can still see that. Now, that's one way you can do that. You can also do this more visually through the Layers panel. Let's go here to the Window menu and show the Layers panel. In here we have one layer right now. All of the things are on that one particular layer. If I hide that layer, notice that everything is gone. So each layer is kind of like a folder to store stuff in. This is very different than Photoshop layers if you're used to Photoshop layers. Everything in Photoshop is a separate layer. The Photoshop layers are more similar to objects in Illustrator. Like in Illustrator, that's kind of one layer, if you will. This one's another layer, if you will. This one's another layer, if you will, in Photoshop terms. In Illustrator, we just call them an object. So that's one object, that's another object, that's another object. And a layer is just a container of objects. If I open up that layer, I can see the objects that are sitting inside that layer. We can see that the red ring is on top, the green is behind that, and now the yellow star is behind that. But I can visually drag one of them up, and the closer it is to the top, the further in front of other objects it is. So whatever's on top is in front, and whatever's on the bottom is behind. So front on the top, behind on the bottom. If you'd rather visually do it, You can just visually do this, and that's really nice if you have a bunch of objects. You can visually rearrange these things nicely using the Layers panel. Okay. Now, let's say the green rectangle is on top, and maybe this is covering over. And maybe you just want to grab one of those elements like the red ring and bring it on top. See, here in the Layers panel, you can do that. You can see the red ring, whereas here you can't. And you can just drag that up to rearrange those. So that's kind of cool. Another thing you can also do here, which brings us to a nice different way to view things, is there's this idea of outline view. So right now we have these 3 different objects. And if one of the objects that has a fill covers over other objects, you can't see those other objects. But we can switch over to an outline view. In outline view, you don't see fills and strokes, you just see the shape of the object indicated in black. Now, all of these things are just, think of them like this could be like a wireframe view if you think about it as wireframes. So you could just click on one of these and you're just reaching through the objects. It's as though these are like empty wires with nothing in between. So even though this top one, which is the green object, even though that has a fill in the preview mode, it doesn't have a fill now. So I could just click on that. And let's just go back for a second before I do anything. Let's go back to the preview. So the green is on top. I cannot see the red circle. I can switch to outline. I can grab that circle and I can say object, arrange, bring to front, which right now you can't really see the difference. But when I switch back to previewing, now I can see that it's on top. So that's one way you can go in and find objects. Like if they're kind of hidden behind something, switch to outline view. Brain, and the GPU is your video card's brain. So why does this matter? Well, the GPU preview, which is your graphics card preview, and by the way, if you don't have this whole CPU or GPU, it's just because you don't have a supported video card or you're on an old version of Illustrator. It used to be that Illustrator just had outline and preview mode. That's it. Now on newer supported video cards with newer versions of Illustrator, they may have this GPU preview. So GPU preview is supposed to be faster. That when you're zooming in and out, everything is faster because it's all rendered on your video card. So it defaults to that GPU preview. So if you switch to outline, you're switching back to GPU preview, which means you know you're using the video card preview. It's the fastest preview, but sometimes there might be display glitches, possibly. So if you ever have any rendering glitches, you can always try previewing on the CPU, and you might get slightly different display. Like maybe the quality might be a little bit better or something, but it's going to be slower. So not necessarily slow, but slower. The GPU preview is faster. So I would say leave it on the GPU preview, and you can tell right here in your tab of your file what preview you're currently using. I would say leave it on the GPU preview unless you have a problem, and then you can switch to the CPU preview, which just says preview. Once you've switched it though, the whole outline and preview mode remembers that. So Command Y on the Mac right here, or Control Y on Windows is to go in and out of the preview mode. It just remembers whatever your setting was. So most likely you don't have to think about it. I just wanted to point out why it says GPU preview. So for the most part, just don't worry about it. Just leave it on the GPU preview unless you have a problem. You might try the CPU preview if you're having some sort of problem. All right. What's next? Okay. Let me open up a file here. File open. Go to my desktop here to my files. Let's grab this B here. Yeah, I want to do something with that. And then also, yeah, let's do it here too. Let's do it on these two objects. Just want to show you a couple different examples of something. I'm going to give this a fill by clicking on the fill color and choosing Christmas is coming up, so let's do green and red. Okay. Now, as I resize this, so we've talked about resizing this way for an individual object, but if I select multiple objects, which I can do by just dragging a box that touches them, you don't have to completely enclose them in this selection box. Notice I'm using the selection tool, the black arrow. As long as that little selection box touches everything, you're going to get it. And then you get this thing called a bounding box, bounding around all of the stuff that's selected. And that's how you can scale things. Now, as you drag, you can unproportionally scale, but make sure you hold Shift if you want to proportionally scale. The only thing is that, take a look at the difference here. I'm going to leave this copy here, and I'm going to copy and paste. Make a copy here. And I'm going to hold Shift, and I'm going to scale this down. And you tell me, does this really look like a smaller version of that, or is there something different? If you look closely, the thickness of the lines is exactly the same across both of these. This has a 5-point stroke. This also has a 5-point stroke. The problem is, on a small thing, the small thing really shouldn't have a 5-point stroke anymore. It didn't scale the stroke proportionally down. It should have, if I wanted to keep this looking exactly the same. So there's a preference that you can turn on and off, and there's a reason. It's a good reason why they did it this way. This is a preference you'll want to turn on and off. For example, if you draw a rectangle that has a 5-point stroke, technically speaking, as you resize this, you're kind of scaling it. Do you really want to be making a smaller stroke at this point, or do you just want to be resizing it? Probably just want to be resizing it. You know, if you make 2 of these and you make them smaller, you might always want all of your strokes to remain 5 points because you want them to all be consistent, even if you make some bigger and smaller, because you just want a consistent 5-point stroke all around. But when it comes to scaling a piece of art like this, if you want it to scale the stroke, you have to be able to toggle the preference in your thing, in your settings here. So over here in the toolbar, there's a scale tool. Now you can choose the scale tool, and you can drag in your document to scale, but that's typically not how I'm often doing this. I'm often doing this kind of numerically by double-clicking on the scale tool. Double-clicking on the scale tool is actually the same thing as going into Object, Transform, Scale. It's the same thing, but I like double-clicking the tool. Like if I see a rotate tool, I want to double-click the rotate tool to set numeric options. If I see the scale tool, I can double-click the scale tool because it's right there. I don't have to go into a menu. It's the same thing, though, as going into the transform settings here. You could do your rotate or your scale numerically. I'm just getting there as a shortcut by double-clicking the scale tool. Now, notice in here that we can optionally scale corners, strokes, and effects. So like rounded corners, you probably want your rounded corners to scale too if you want to make your little version exactly the same as the big one, just scaled down. So they're turned off by default. Let's turn those things on, and let's scale this down like 50%. Just check on preview. See now, let's go like 40%. See if we don't scale those versus do scaling them, it looks completely different. So let's turn that on and hit OK. Now that preference is now remembered. In the future, if I ever go back in and I do some scaling, it's going to remember to scale those things. So let's go see one more example of this. I'm going to go to my bee here, zoom in. This bee has some wings that have strokes, black stroke, 1 point. If I select that bee and I want to scale it down, let's make a copy of that. Copy and paste to make a copy of that. If I want to scale him down, double click on the scale tool. Let's do 50% size, scaling all the things, especially strokes and effects. That bee is going to look like just a smaller version of the big bee. Looks good. Let's make another copy of him. Now, to make copies, you can do copy and paste like I've been doing, or as a shortcut, you can Option drag on the Mac or Alt drag on Windows. It's a quicker way to just pull off a copy. Now let's do a different scale. Double click. Same percentage, but now I'm not going to scale the strokes and effects. Oops, I didn't quite get all of his stuff. Let me just get all of his stuff. I want to get all his pieces. Double click on scale. Not scale strokes and effects. And look at how much thicker his wings are. This looks like an appropriately scaled down version of that wing. This one does not. It looks different. Excuse me. So when scaling and you want to keep the appearance the same, then it's a good thing to have this and this checked on, you want to have those checked on. But bigger than just that happening this one time, this becomes a preference that's always used for scaling. So even if you're not using that dialog, let me just revert this file here. Even if you're not using that dialog anymore, that's like a document preference that stays on all the time. So even as I do this, it's scaling strokes. That's because I'm doing a scale, right? I'm scaling strokes up and down. Let's draw a box. Option drag a copy. Make this one smaller. See now my boxes, this one's scaled down so the stroke doesn't match. So it depends on what you're drawing. It's nice to be able to just double click to go into here, and you don't even need something selected to change this because it's a preference. You can just uncheck it. Nothing needed to be changed. And now as you scale, my strokes remain the same. Okay. So main thing of that is just be aware that that preference exists, and that once you set it, it stays on until you change it. Okay. Alrighty. Yep. Let's see what's next. Okay. Let's delete all this stuff here. What's the difference between the, oh, and actually I noticed a question, actually it's from a little bit ago in the chat. There was just a question about layers and kind of, do you need layers? Right, why do you need layers in Illustrator if you have objects? Okay, so I think that's a good question. So let's go back and, why do you need layers if you have objects? Good question. When you're drawing something, actually open up that B again. Okay. So here I have this B. Notice that we have multiple layers here. Now in a new file, when you just create a new file yourself, you're just going to have one layer. Everything is going to be thrown onto that one layer. You can create new layers by clicking the New Layer button and then drawing things on that layer. Let's draw some circles on that layer that look different. Okay. You can use layers in several ways. One is to put a bunch of things together. Let me just make a couple copies of these. Let's fill them with different colors here. Like so. By grouping them together, I'm going to call this layer circles. Just double click on a name of a layer to rename it. In older versions, you'd get a little dialog that would appear. Now you can just rename it right here. Okay. Because I've grouped things into these two different layers, first of all, I can hide and show one of those layers. I can also rearrange the whole group of elements. So all the elements on that layer can be rearranged. The other thing is that I can also lock. By clicking in this empty column, I can lock that layer. That's nice as we work because especially things like backgrounds, you might want to lock so you don't accidentally move them. For example, let's say you were doing something with this B. You might want a new layer called background. I'd want to put that on the very bottom. I can draw my background shape, change my fill color here, and I can then lock it so that now as I'm working and I'm trying to select things, I'm not accidentally working with that background. I can also hide the background, show the background to see, do I really like that or do I not? For example, the B stripes are on their own layer. I can hide those to see, do I like it with the B stripes or not? You know, by separating things out onto different layers, we can hide and show them. We can optionally lock them so that we don't accidentally work with them. So it's purely for organizational purposes. That's why we use layers. Nothing in Illustrator forces you to ever use layers because by nature, all these objects are kind of like distinct layers by themselves. That's very different than Photoshop. So layers really are just purely organizational, and it depends on how you want to work. The main advantages are to be able to rearrange front to back order, to lock and to hide. Those are the reasons to be able to work with layers. Those are reasons why you might want to use them. So I think that was a good question. Thank you for asking that in the chat. All right. We're basically halfway through, and before I get into the next topic, I think we should take a 5-minute stretch break. I'd like to throw up a timer here where we count the 5 minutes down. So go grab a drink, use the restroom, whatever you need to do. If you're watching the recording later on, you can fast forward, but let's take 5 minutes, and when we come back, we'll do more cool stuff with Illustrator. All right. Back to Illustrator stuff. I'm going to just close this file here and start off fresh again. Just to go over this dialogue a little bit more here. The main difference here between the web and print, for example, are document sizes, but the biggest difference really is, aside from the preset sizes, are RGB color versus CMYK color. So that's the main reason to choose web versus print, in addition to the presets. These are just some of the presets. You can click the plus to view the rest of the presets. Same thing here with the web. These are just some. You can click the plus to choose between the presets. And in earlier versions, it was the same idea. It's just you had menus instead of icons to click on. I'm going to go back to print here, choose this, and switch to inches for this. All right. Let's talk about the difference between the white arrow and the black arrow, or more specifically, the selection tool and the direct selection tool. Let's say that we draw a shape, such as a star. I'm going to go with fewer points by hitting my down arrow. Hold my command key to separate these out a little bit more. Also, if I hold shift, notice how it locks in. So here I've got a little bit of an angle. Shift always kind of makes you perfect, if you will, or snaps you to something. So for example, when I'm drawing with the line tool, if I hold shift, snap to every 45 degree or 90 degree angle. Oh. Thank you for the tunes. I wish there was some, I can't hear them when I'm doing these live streams. I wish there was some way that I could, just to be able to stream the audio and from my mic and the tunes. I can't hear it. I wish there was some way that I could set that up. But anyway, okay, thank you for reminding me. Okay, so we were talking about editing shapes, right? So here I've got this shape, and let me just switch over so that it's a fill of red or orange and no stroke. All right, that's what I want. Let's say I want to bring out one of these points. If I use the black arrow, I'm sizing the element non-proportionally if I don't hold shift, or if I hold shift, proportionally. What if I want to go in and grab one of these points? The white arrow, or the direct selection tool, lets me go in and grab points, called anchor points. And I can grab any of those anchor points and move it around. If I hold shift, it will move in a 45 or 90 degree angle. So I can hold shift and drag it up. Let's say I drag this one over holding shift. I drag this one holding over shift. Or let's say, for example, I go back. Okay, let's undo. So Illustrator has unlimited undos. You don't have a history panel like you do in Photoshop if you're used to that, but you do have unlimited undos. All right. The whole idea of the direct selection tool is to work with points. Now you can move any individual point, or you can select multiple ones. These points are very small when you first look at them. The dots are quite small. There's a preference which you can set under Anchor Display. This is under Illustrator Preferences on the Mac, or Edit Preferences on Windows. I'm going to go in here to the Anchor Display, and I like to set the anchors not to a different style, but to a bigger size. So this lets me do bigger ones. The handles don't let me go bigger. It would be a different style because there's like 3 different styles. It's already on the bigger one of those. But this is the same kind of style, just bigger little dots. I'm going to click OK. So now we get slightly bigger dots for those, but they sometimes can still be a little bit hard to see. When you mouse over one, it gets bigger, indicating that you're over it, and you can click on it. I'm going to zoom in on my screen here just so you can see this better, hopefully. Notice that if I click on one, that it becomes blue to indicate that it's selected, and the other ones are white. They're hollow, which means they're not selected. If you shift-click, you can select multiple ones. So I could shift-click all those in-betweens. Now, why would I want to select in-betweens? Well, maybe I want to go to my Scale tool and then drag to scale those in or out. That's how you can change the radius later on. Or, let me undo that. Let's say I go to my rotate tool, and then I give that a little bit of a twist. Oh, that's kind of cool. That's interesting. So that's the kind of neat thing that you can do by selecting individual points. What if we went to the polygon tool? Drag that out. Oh, good. It's already on a triangle, which is what I want. I can go to the direct selection tool, and I can, oops, I missed the point. See, if you're a little bit off, it'll grab the whole shape potentially. So if you drag in the middle on the fill, you move the whole shape. But if you click off and then just grab exactly the anchor point, they'll let you grab just the anchor point. So it is very nitpicky. You have to be exactly right on the thing you want to move. And if you're a little bit off, you might accidentally move either the whole line, which is something else you can do. Let me undo the move there. I can actually grab this whole line and pull the whole line down. Or if you grab on the fill, you'll move the whole shape. Okay. I can also select multiple points by dragging a selection over them. And for example, with the rounded corners, I could round just some of those corners, which is really cool. You don't have to adjust all the corners. You can adjust them individually. Let's say I do a star. I can use my direct selection tool to select just the inner points, and I could round just the inner ones. Or I could undo that. Maybe I select this, shift click works, or shift drag. And shift drag might be a little bit easier because you don't have to be quite so precise. If I only select the outside ones and pull those in, then it's just the outside ones, not the inside ones. Pretty neat. This works on kind of any shape that you create. You can use the black arrow to move the shape and the white arrow to move parts of the shape. So the direct selection is the part, whereas the regular selection is the whole. That's the key. That's how you do logos, for example. Let's say I want to make a logo. For example, the Noble desktop logo actually was originally set in a font called Orbitron. Forget what weight we used. All right, let's make this bigger. Now, as long as this is a piece of type, it will remain editable. I can go in, I can change the weight, I can change the size, I can change the color, all that good stuff. I can change whatever I want. And let's just go back to black for now. And let's say I want to go in and yeah, I think we actually chose, let's go back to medium like that. Let's say you want to change the shape of things though. Let's say we just want to do desktop for right now. Just focus on that. Make that nice and big. Right now this is a piece of type. It's not an editable piece of art. If I view an outline view, we'll basically still see the same thing. The only difference is that it wouldn't preview color. For example, if I did have this being a color, let's go to a nice bright red there. Excuse me. If I preview in outline mode, it just goes black for all type. Let's go back to preview. I want to convert this to art, which means going to the type menu and creating outlines. This will actually render it as a piece of art as though I drew it with my vector shapes. If you now switch to outline mode, you see it's different. It's not filled. It's now just a wire frame. It's no longer editable as type because I converted it to outlines. And that's not something I can just easily fix. Like if you get some type that has been converted to outlines, you can't just make it type again. It's art, and it doesn't understand it as anything other than art. But the advantage, the reason to doing this is so that you can go in with your direct selection tool and you can select points. And let's say I hit my up arrow key twice to just give that a little bit of a slant. I can select multiple ones of these and just hit my up arrow key twice to give them slants. Maybe this one goes down. Maybe this one here goes over. Same thing here. You know, I can give it this kind of customized shape. True story here. One of the things we didn't like about Orbitron was the K was kind of long in the middle here. We didn't like that. We liked the rest of the font, but we didn't like this middle part. I can just drag a selection over all of this stuff and then slide this over a little bit. I want to make sure I'm holding shift as I do that, or I can use my arrow keys to nudge it. And then I just eliminated that middle part of that. You can totally go in and customize things. For example, maybe you don't like these things coming down. So I can, or maybe you want them to come down more or somehow differently. You can change the shape of things here. So you can go in and customize something so it's not just your kind of standard Orbitron. You can do a customized, individualized piece of art. And that's how you can start to create one potential way to start creating a logo or an identity that is unique, that you start with a font and then you continue and make it your own and make it unique. Okay. Now, I want to get into more customized drawing. We've just been doing basic shapes here. And I want to start to get towards being able to create things like this. All right. The way that we draw a lot of these fundamental things is by breaking a complex shape down into its primary components. And if you think about this cloud, this is really just circle, circle, circle. So say I want to draw that. I'm going to choose my ellipse, hold shift as I draw a circle. I'm going to go here to my stroke and say none, fill, let's give it some cyan. I've got one of my circles now. I can option drag on the Mac or alt drag a copy. I can alt or option drag another one, and this one I think I want to make a little bit smaller so that not all the bubbles are exactly, the kind of puffy versions are not all the same. Now I do want to make sure that this is lined up on the bottom, and smart guides do help me to line up. The smart guides just dynamically appear, or if they are getting in the way or they're hard to use, you can also align things yourself by clicking on one thing, shift clicking on another, and then aligning. Your align options may show automatically up here if you have a big enough screen. I have to click the align button to see these, or I can go into the align panel, the same thing. The align panel just pops open over here, but if you don't want to go there, you just want to select things. Oh, see, like here now they are fitting. So sometimes you'll see the align buttons right there, or you might have to click align to see those buttons. I want to align their bottoms, so I'm going to click this button, and those bottoms align. All right, so I've got the outer shape, except I need a flat thing going across here. I'll just draw a rectangle for that. And just kind of fill that out like so. So you don't have to go in and custom draw these shapes. You can just use your basic shapes. And the cool thing is that I can still go in there and customize this all to really create the shape that it is that I'm looking for. For the lightning that I want to add, I would start with a rectangle, and then I'd use my direct selection tool to just select the two bottom points and use my arrow keys to nudge it over. Maybe grab this point, use my arrow keys to nudge it over. You can drag with your mouse if you prefer. You can then also drag them around like so. But you're using that starting rectangle to just switch it around a little bit. I'll use my regular selection tool to option drag a copy. Kind of get that set up there. But I need a point on the end, so I'll use my direct selection tool to pull that point over, like so. Now, any of these shapes you can still move around, and they're all independent, because if you look at this in outline mode, you can still see all the basic shapes that I have here. Notice you can't see them here, so why is that a little different? Let's go back in. If I wanted to put a stroke around this, right now I could not put a single stroke around the whole shape because it's really a bunch of different shapes. As long as I don't have the stroke, it's not a problem to leave it this way, but if it is one thing that I want, I need to merge these together. And the way that I can merge them together is by selecting all of them. I'm shift clicking each one individually to select them all. And then I can use my Pathfinder panel. I have it open right here, but if you can't find it, you can always find it under a window. Pathfinder. there's different shape modes that you can use. Unite will unite them all together. When you click it, and actually let me go back, let me undo. Let's put on that stroke that I was talking about and zoom in. There you go. Watch when I click Unite. Boom. It's one thing. Now this is on top, so let's just move that out of the way for the moment just so you can see. This is now one shape. If I preview this in outline mode, see it's one shape. The only downside to that, though, is that now I can't individually move those circles around. I can't resize the circles. So I don't really like that part of that. So let's undo. Let's go back. Remember, unlimited undos here. Okay. Let's move this down out of the way for the moment. There's a trick. When I go here and I mouse over it, it says Unite, but then it also says Option click to create a compound shape. That would be Alt click on Windows. So let's do that. Instead of just clicking, I'm going to Option click, or on Windows, Alt click. And that gives me the same end effect that I want, that there's kind of considered one shape with one stroke. But behind the scenes, if I look at this in outline view, it still remembers all my primary basic shapes. So I can still go into that and use, for example, my direct selection tool to select one of those things. When I switch back to my selection tool, I can still change this. And even though the shapes that are kind of making that up are individually editable, they still are being merged live. Like this is what we consider a live Pathfinder. It's kind of a hidden thing that they did. And depending on your version of Illustrator, they might have toggled it. They've gone back and forth over different versions of Illustrator. This is something that old-time Illustrator people fight about. Personally, I don't like this default. I don't like that it's destructive by default. I like the live Pathfinder because I feel like that live Pathfinder is really useful and people might not find it. But some people like the destructive Pathfinder. And so the default thing has been kind of changing across different versions. It's been this way for a while now, but your version might default to being live. And in your case, option clicking might expand it by default. So you'll just have to see with your version whether you have to click or option click, depending. They might have switched those two around. Same thing with this. If you have a stroke on that and you want that to be one object, you could option or alt click that. But there's still behind the scenes the two sub shapes. Ways to go in and edit the sub shapes. You can double click on a group to go into that group and edit the things within it. So that's like a compound shape, which is considered like a group. And when you double click to go out, you leave that isolation mode. So when you have a group and you double click, you go into what's like called an isolation mode. See over here it says isolation mode. And you're not working with anything else in the document other than the things that are in there. It's a way to go into a group without ungrouping. You can double click out to leave that isolation mode, or if you double click to go in, you can also use the back button here also to go back. My stroke sizes are different here. That's 3 points. This is 3 points, so we could do that. And that might be nice if we want to make that yellow. Oops. Click on fill, change to yellow. Now we might want to do something like that. Good question. So somebody's asking, can you explain expand? Yeah, so right now these are live. It means that I can double click, I can go in there and do this. Okay, so they're all separate. Notice there's an expand button. If I click expand, that's like a render. It's a make it so, make it permanent. Now, notice it's all one shape. So in other words, if you do a couple shapes like this, the default when you click Unite is that it creates the compound shape and automatically expands it, just by default. The alternative is, let me undo that. If I option click, I create the compound shape and it's live. And only if and when I want to, I could optionally expand. and expand will like render it and make it so. The only reason to do that is if you want to individually go and edit the final shape. Like maybe you don't want to edit these things as individual things. Maybe you want to edit this exact curve and this exact corner. That expand button will make it render, and it makes it actually one shape. They're not made up of their sub-shapes. So think of that expand in that case. It's kind of a way of like apply, like make it permanent, make it not live. So it's not something you have to do, just something that you could do if you want to change the way that you edit it. Another quick thing, just to show a fun little alternative. I'm going to draw a black background here real quick. And I temporarily don't want to work with this object. I don't want to be able to select this object. I could make a layer called background and I could lock it, but if you just want to lock one thing, you just go to Object, Lock that selection. And that way you can't accidentally work with it. At any point, you can always go back and unlock everything, and it's available again. But just for one thing, you could just say, hey, lock that selection. Okay, so now I have a nice little background. I'm going to make a Pac-Man. I'm going to draw a circle that is yellow. And I'm going to draw another circle on top for the eye. And then I'm going to draw a triangle for the mouth. I'm going to use my rotate tool to rotate that to make the mouth. Cool. Now, as long as you're on a black background, this might look fine. Let me go back and unlock everything. But let's say I change the background color to something different. We realize, oh, it just looked like those were holes. They weren't really holes. I really should be able to use this on whatever background I want. So these things really should be knocked out of the yellow. So it's as though they're not even there. For that, I need to use the Pathfinder. I'm going to select all of these shapes. Instead of uniting, I'm now going to minus the front. And then the front objects get minused or subtracted out of it. But again, if I want to change the mouth, I'm sunk right now. I can't, well, I mean, I could kind of change it, but not as a separate triangle. It's not a separate triangle that I can change. So let me undo. Again, I'm going to, in this case, prefer to option click to minus the fronts, because then my triangle is still there. I can still go in and edit that. So if I double click on my shape, I can go in and change that. I can make the mouth bigger. I can rotate it. I can change it around, and that's for me, I think that's a really cool thing, that you can live edit those things, that you don't have to be perfect when you're initially drawing. And they actually are holes, so it doesn't matter what background you have, you've actually removed that. Another question in the chat, could you put the shapes into a group to non-destructively expand? Expanding is destructive, so there is no such thing as non-destructive expansion. To expand means to make a destructive change. It's a permanent change. Okay. All right. Now, let's do the plug down here. Think about this as primary basic shapes and building this up. We're going to start drawing it vertical, and then we're going to rotate it on the 45-degree angle, but we're going to draw the plug upright to start with. So I'm going to draw a circle first, and then I want to remove the top half. So I'm going to draw a box that covers over the top half. I don't have to change the color, but I'll just change the color just so you can see it. I'm going to select those two things, and if you feel confident, like in this case, I know I need a half circle. I'm not going to change it. This, I think, would be fine to do minus front and make it permanent, just because I don't need to change that. So the live, while I like it, I don't always use the live compound shape. If I know, hey, I only want a half circle, I don't want to have two things. Like if I kept it live, I'd have this other thing to kind of be in the way. Just, it's not that it's really in the way, it's just I see it. So I don't need to have that. So I'm confident that I want to do it. Just going to minus the front. It's done. Now I can draw the plugs. I'll draw a rectangle here. Adjust the width. I'm going to option drag a copy of that. Now I want to make sure that those are the same height. So I drag a selection box across them, and I can adjust them at the same time. And I want to center them on this other object, which actually is pretty cool. I can just drag it, and look, they help me to align that. It's pretty awesome. I want to make this a little bit smaller. So I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. Align that. Now, you see how smart objects don't always line up there? So it depends on the objects that you're bringing in as to whether they'll kind of snap or not. Then I can option drag one of these to create that part. All right, so I think that's a pretty good looking plug. Now I need to draw the background circle. So let's draw a circle behind this. Draw a circle that is red. Send it to the back. And then I can select these by shift clicking, and I can make those white. And I can rotate it. Use my rotate tool, start dragging, and I hold shift to snap to a 45-degree angle. And we've got our plug icon. Now, let's say I want to throw this on a background, though. Delete my Pac-Man, throw this on a background, and send this to the back. There we go. So once again, it's not that the plug was cut out. It was just looking fine on a white background. If that's what you need, that's all you have to do. But you might want to cut them out. In this case, I think it might be nice to keep them live in case I want to tweak anything about the settings of those prongs or any individual part. So I'm going to option click minus front. And see, now it really has removed the prong. And this is literally like a see-through shape. Pretty cool. Another question in the chat, do live shapes slow things down or use more memory? Not that I've ever noticed. All right, next. Drawing custom shapes. This is more complex, this fire part. And so this is where we can't always just use primary shapes to build up to a more complex shape. In that case, we might have to draw some stuff by hand. There are a few ways to draw things. Just a few. Now, there's a bunch of different ways. For example, the way you think Illustrator would probably work is, when I clicked on this shaper tool here, they popped open this tutorial about the shaper tool because I reset my preferences before I did this seminar, just so I had the default ones. I don't need to do this tutorial, but you can kind of look through it if you want to, just to kind of see like what the shaper thing's about. I'm just going to close that. I want to go to the pencil tool. The pencil tool is what I feel like when I first thought how Illustrator is going to draw, I kind of thought it would draw like the pencil tool, where as you draw, you get a line. Now, you do need to have some sort of thing to be visible. So I have no fill and no stroke somehow. I'm going to click on a stroke so that we can see that. Let's make that thicker. So every time I draw, I get a new stroke, a new line. That's kind of how I thought Illustrator would be. But that does mean also that, you know, if I wiggle my mouse or move something around, it's not necessarily the best quality. Depends on the kind of effect you're going for. Some people like this freeform feeling, but other people want more precise control. I want more precise control. So the pencil is not appropriate for what I want to do. But if you want to use a pencil tool, in sometimes it's perfectly appropriate. Let's say you are going to draw something. It might not be quite as good as you hoped it would be. So after you use the pencil tool, there's some other tools that you can use to fix it, like a path eraser. You can go in and erase part of the pencil if you don't want it to be there. And actually, if you erase the beginning part, it just shortens it. But if you erase the middle part, you actually break your path into two paths, which is kind of interesting. Let's go back into the pencil tool. and draw a little bit. The other thing you can do is use the smooth tool, and every time you drag over the selected path, it does have to be selected, which it still is by default, by the way. When you draw with your pencil tool, it keeps it selected. Now, if you deselected it yourself by using your selection tool and clicking off of it, then if you try to come back in with a smooth tool, you're going to wonder why it's not working. It's because it's not selected. You've got to use your selection tool to select it, and then you can use your smooth tool. Each time you drag over the path with the smooth tool, it smooths it out. Dragging and not letting go, all you're doing is highlighting what's going to be smoothed one time. I've really highlighted all that line. I'm not getting it more and more smooth each time I go across, not until I let go. When you let go, it does one application of smoothing. Now, if I drag again and let go, it does another application of smoothing. So don't keep going back and forth thinking you're going to get a lot of smoothing. You're not. Drag over it once, drag over it twice, but releasing in between the drags is what's going to get you more and more smoothing. And the more and more you smooth, the more it kind of evens it all out. But here's a pretty awesome thing a lot of people don't know about. The pencil tool is for sketching, which means you can go back and fix things if you made a mistake, such as going back and fixing a portion of it. Wow, that's pretty cool. I wish in real life that pencils could do that. Remove some other part without me having to actually erase it. Just that I could go in there and say, hey, let's fix that one part. So the idea is that if you go from one point to another point, you just make a different middle for that. Notice the cursor. When you get close, the asterisk disappears. When you see the asterisk on the cursor, that means a new line. When you see the asterisk go away, that means you're going to be editing the current line. And so if you could go off in a different direction for one of the ends, or if you go from one point in the middle to another point in the middle, then you're going to redraw that point in the middle. What a lot of people don't think about is that all the tools that you use in Illustrator ultimately just create paths. And that means they all are interchangeable with each other. Let's say you draw a rectangle. It's a path. You can use the pencil tool to go in there and change something about it. It's no longer a rectangle, but it was still a path. You can change it. No big deal. Pretty cool. All right. So that's the pencil tool. Let's talk about the pen tool. When you want precision, the pen tool is the way to go. The pen tool is nothing like any normal thing you've ever drawn with in life. The pen tool is a uniquely computer-generated concept. I never saw anything in real life that prepared me for the pen tool. It is the vector Bezier drawing at its core. So it's going to work differently than anything you've ever done. And this is where the more practice you get with the pen, the better you're going to get. The learning curve, in my opinion, on this is not the easiest. When you first are learning this, it's going to feel really hard. Like, I feel like this is the learning curve. Like, it's really hard, but then all of a sudden, you understand it. Like, it kind of clicks in. So don't get frustrated. Try to keep at it. Don't lose hope. You'll eventually get it. It's been really cool when I've seen people struggle in class, and then at some point, all of a sudden, click, just like a light in their head goes on. All of a sudden, they're like, I get it. And then they just start drawing, and they're like, I totally get it. And sometimes there's just that aha click moment where you didn't get it, and then you do, and now all of a sudden you're drawing like a whiz. So I'm going to give you points to try to help you understand what's going on here. There are only 3 kind of points, and you can draw anything you want with 3 kind of points: corners, curves, and straight points. So clicking creates straight points, like connecting dots. This is the easiest kind of drawing. If you wanted to draw a skyline, click. Now, if you don't hold shift, you can get angles. So I'm going to hold shift just so I don't get anything other than a 45 or 90 degree angle. So if I shift click, just shift click, I can get any kind of skyline that I want. Yeah, pretty cool. I can even put some angles in there. Draw a city skyline. Pretty neat. When I'm done, come back to my selection tool. I've just drawn a skyline. All right. Straight lines are the easy way. It's like connecting the dots. You go click to click to click. Don't drag, just click, click, click. That's for straight points. That's not so hard. The harder part gets when you get into curves, the second kind of point. For that, you drag. And you drag. And you drag. Now, what you're dragging out are these handles. And these handles are shaping the line. These are called direction handles. Okay, so let's think about what do we want to draw. I'm going to draw something kind of sketchy with the pencil tool. And let's say you want to draw a wave. But much better than that, because that is a pretty horrible wave. And that's exactly why I want to use my pen tool, because I want to draw a nice, clean wave. Let's say I want to draw it with the pen tool. This should be much smoother than it is, but in general, when you think about this as kind of broken down into curves, this is kind of a curve here, oops, if you will. So this is like a curve here, and then this is another curve here, and then this is another curve here. So it's kind of like 1, 2, 3 curves. So if you break things down into their basic curves, that's going to help you a lot. You're going to click at the start and the end points of those curves. And the drag is going to control the force and curvature of the line. I'm going to click and drag, come here, click and drag, come up here, click and drag, and I've started to create that curve. Now, it's not very smooth, but I'm starting to lay down the points. I can always smooth it out in a moment. But here's a couple rules of thumb to think about. From point A to point B, you're going to click and hold the mouse down and drag out these handles. When you let go, you're then going to move over to where you want to end that portion of the curve, and then click and drag. A couple of things to keep in mind when you're creating a segment of a curve. If you drag really big, like let's say, for example, say you want to draw an egg. All right? We can draw an egg in 2 segments, like so. Okay, so how did that work? There's the top part of the curve and the bottom part of the curve. So really 2 curves make up an egg. So I'm going to go from the first point. I'm going to click, and my line is heading up, so I'm dragging up. But it's not heading directly up. It's going to want to slant for a nice egg. You know, normally one side of the egg is a little bigger than the other. So I'm going to give it a little slant, and I'm going to let go. Then I'm going to come over to where the curve ends, the other side. Now the curve is heading down, so I'm going to click and drag down. So you want to drag in the direction the line is currently heading. And you want to choose the angle for how it's going to come in and go out of that particular point. When you let go, I can then go back to the finish point. Now, if I just clicked, remember that when you click, you create a straight point. I don't want a straight point. If you drag, you create curved points. So every time you want a curve, drag to create the curve. Amazing what you can draw in 2 curves. As you get better, you'll use fewer and fewer curves like this. Somebody might draw an egg with a few more curves. What would happen in that case? Let's say you break this into like quarters instead of halves. If you click and drag up here, and then here you put another point, any place you put that point is a potential place where you can change the curve. And so there can be advantages and disadvantages to that. One advantage is that, of course, you get more control, but because you can change it, that also means that you might not make it the way you want. It might not be as smooth. Fewer points mean smoother curves. The more points you put on, every point might twist the curve in a little way that you might not want. Now remember that the black arrow moves the whole shape, but the direct selection, the white arrow, moves individual points. You can come back to a point and you can change it. So every place you put a point, you get 2 handles, 1 for each side. when you're doing these curved points. So one advantage of having a handle down here is that you can kind of flatten out the bottom of the egg. You might want that control. But see, then on the sides, you have to be careful that you're evening out that side. So it's kind of cool that you can pull this in if you want to. You can make it kind of pointy. And that each side could actually be different if you want that control. But if you want smoothness, you want fewer curves, fewer points. So let's go back to my wave, the poorly drawn wave that I was doing. So this is like a wave in an ocean. I know, it's pathetic. Let's draw a nice, good version of this. So curve, another curve, and then a third curve. Okay, let's draw a better version of this. My line is starting to head down. So drag in the direction your line is starting to head. It's starting to head to the right and down. And you drag about a third of the way, just a rough rule of thumb, or about a third of the way to the next point you're going to make. That's important because if your handles are too big, they start to bind up and hit each other. Like here, it's way past that other point. It's binding up. It's not being smooth. If your handles are roughly like a third here and a third here, just a rough rule of thumb. It doesn't have to be exactly 1/3 and 1/3, just an idea. Just part of the way there, you're going to get a nice smooth curve. Now here, as I'm cresting and I'm coming to the point, I'm going to click and drag again. And see, this is where experience helps you. You can drag out big curves. The bigger the curve, the more it pushes in that direction. The smaller the curve, the less it pushes. But also, how do you want to enter that point? Do you want to enter it in from the bottom? Do you want to enter it in from the top? So you're adjusting two things. The distance, right, that the path is going to travel into by making a bigger or smaller curve, and then also the angle. Those are the two things you want to pay attention to. Now, at this point, if I continue drawing, notice that I'm getting a very rounded tip. I don't want to get a rounded tip. So the third kind of point, right, we talked about straight points where you click. We talked about curves where you drag. Now we're at corners. For a corner, this handle right now is pointing that it goes out. I want to go this way. So on the Mac, you have to hold Option. On Windows, you hold Alt. And you can point this direction handle in the right new direction. But it's not a smooth point, a smooth curve. It's a pointy corner. Excuse me. So now it's heading in the right direction. Again, you have to consider how far in that direction. Then I can come to the last point and click and drag, and it's kind of heading up, so I'm going to head up. Now, it's not perfect by any means, but I've got the shell. I've got the right number of points. They're in the right place generally. So now I can come back in with my direct selection tool, and I can individually move these things around, and I can change their handles. So now I can really smooth this out into exactly what it is that I want. But I feel like my first approach with a pen sometimes is my first initial sketch, if you will. And then once I've got those points there, then I can go back in and kind of play with the shape. And I can move the points around. So if you want more of a crest, kind of a pointy crest here, you can pull this over like so. And then you can go in and adjust the rest of this so that it matches. So the things you can do are to move the point, to change the length of the handle, which pushes it further away or closer to that point, and you can change the angle. By playing with this handle on this side and the other handle on the other side, that is how you control the shape of the curve. And with those three kind of points, you can draw anything that you can imagine. All right, so let's draw this fire. Got a little template here for us to draw because I want you to know in your mind kind of what I'm picturing in my mind. You know, you don't always have to trace over something like this, but you could potentially, if you, let's say you do a hand sketch, you could scan it in, and then if you do a file place, you can place a file in and draw over it like a sketch. So let me just create a new file here. You could do a file place, and some people still like to hand draw and then sketch. you could totally do that. So any kind of file, whatever it is, like it could be a photo that you want to draw over or something else, you could place it in here and then you could draw over it. If you're going to do that, though, it's because this is a selectable object, it's best when you're placing your scan that, or your digital photo, you know, if you take a picture on your iPhone or something and copy it over to your computer, if you're placing this in, show the options. And so the elephant, check on template. You don't have to link it. Linking would mean that you have to keep your original file sitting wherever it was. You don't have to do that. You can just embed it. Check on template, because the template makes a whole template layer and it grays it out, but it locks that template layer so I can't accidentally move it. I draw on top of it, and then eventually you could just get rid of that template layer, but the template layer doesn't print. It's really not meant to be part of the final thing. It purely is for tracing on top of. Okay. So if you want to trace, you can trace. If you don't want to, sometimes you just have something in your mind. This is what I have in my mind, but I'm going to trace over top of this just so you can see kind of the process, if you will. All right. Started the curve, and I kind of think since there's a little bit of a flattening here, and this is where experience comes in. I could theoretically maybe just do 1 point there and 1 point there, but because of this shape, I'm going to need another point here to help flatten it out. These aren't kind of equally smooth, so I'm going to need another point there. So I'm going to click and drag about a third of the way to the next point. And I'm going to click and drag about a third of the way to the next point. And I'm going to click and drag. Now in this case, I know I'm getting to a corner, so I'm really just worried about the kind of the back side of it, not what is going to happen in the next future part. Okay, so now I'm at a corner. Now I have to hold Option or Alt, and then I'm going to go about a third of the way to the next point. Now you see how, let's zoom in on this. You see how that shape isn't quite right. Let me undo and go back. If you ever make a mistake, just undo, and you can undo those things. In that case, and I wanted you to see that, I came inside the shape rather than staying outside. In general, you want to stay outside the shape, because if you're cutting, that literally means to come into the shape. So you want to stay on the outside of it. See how now that is going to give us a better shape. Again, click and drag. Every time you have a smooth curve that you want to make, you have to click and drag. Right? And I say click and drag, I really mean click, hold, and drag. It's not click, release the mouse, and then drag. It has to be one smooth motion. Now here I'm going to Option drag in the right direction. And this is kind of flattening out here, so I'm going to need another point here to flatten it out, because these need to be kind of bigger, flatter handles there. And then here again, I'm going to drag, oops, like so. I'm at a corner, so I Option drag. Then here, I'm going to flatten it out. Here, I'm going to drag. Now, this is a big curve, so I'm going to give it a little bit bigger. And see, that was about a third of the way there. That's about a third. Rough rule of thumb, thirds, kind of the rule of thirds is pretty good. Option drag in the right direction. This is one smooth curve, so I think I can do this all in one. Yeah, it was pretty good. Option drag, point in the right direction. This is a pretty big curve, so it's a pretty big handle there. But then it kind of flattens out down here, so I'm going to do that. And then click and drag. Now notice how this is a smaller curve here, so this is a little bit of a smaller handle. So this was definitely a bigger handle because it was a bigger flattening, and this is a smaller handle because it's a smaller curve. Option drag, point myself the right direction. Click and drag. Click and drag. Option, point myself in the right direction. Click and drag. Now, when you come into the end point, if you clicked and dragged, you'd get a smooth corner, but I don't. I want a pointy corner. So I have to, again, hold Option or Alt on Windows. Bam. On fire. Let's go give myself a just a black fill. I'm going to hit the swap button for just a black fill. Now, if there's any mistakes that you want to correct, go in there with your direct selection tool, click on a point, tweak the handles. You can change the angle, you can change the distance, you can pull it out, you can pull it in, and tweak that thing until you like what you see. All right, now to finish this out, I'm going to draw a background with a rounded rectangle. I'm holding Shift to keep it a perfect square. I'm going to flip the color to make a black stroke that is thicker with a fill of yellow. Give it a little magenta to make it orange. I'm going to send that to the back. And I'm going to use my rotate tool, dragging, holding Shift to snap it to a 45-degree angle. Then I want to line these to each other. So I'm going to Shift click so both are selected and click the center, center. So there we've just recreated our sign. Needs a little bit thicker stroke there, I think. Now, there's all sorts of cool effects that we can add, and I think this is where we're going to, let's do a quick effect and then saving files. Under your appearance panel, this is where effects get added and appear. Appearance is bigger than just a fill and a stroke. It's where a drop shadow would appear, for example. So we can go to Effects, Stylize, Drop Shadow, and that same menu that's up there is also found directly in the appearance panel, Effects, Stylize, Drop Shadow. Be careful what's selected though. For example, if nothing's selected, then the entire object, which is just the background shape, the entire object is going to get the drop shadow. So here we see we're having a drop shadow. You can change the blur. You can change the opacity. If you select a part of the object, for example, the stroke. So notice the stroke right now does not have a drop shadow. Let's get rid of the main drop shadow for a moment. And I'm just going to select the stroke. If the stroke is selected, I could add a drop shadow to just the stroke. So notice that then the stroke looks like it's been offset from the orange background. That's kind of cool. I mean, that's an interesting effect if that's what I'm going for. So now it's the stroke that has the shadow. And you can move that, like if I drop it down here onto the shape, see the difference? So here the whole shape has the shadow, and here the stroke has the shadow. So you can actually add the shadow to any individual part of an element. Okay. All right, so let's talk about saving files. Let's say we want to save this file. I'm going to copy that and paste it into a new document. Let's say we're printing this, so we'd be in a print document, and we have our icon. We can save this as an Adobe Illustrator file. I'll call it flame sign, and I'll throw it down into my files here. Just save as Adobe Illustrator file. Default options here should be fine. Save it as Illustrator. This will be compatible with anything in the Creative Cloud, no matter what the version. If for some reason you need to save back, you could save back, but just do be aware that sometimes if you save back to older formats, sometimes the files can change. So I do like to keep a copy in my version, like CC, and then if I need to give an older version, I will save a copy in the older version to give the person, just in case anything would change. And that Illustrator file is perfectly fine to go into Photoshop or to go into InDesign or whatever other Adobe app you're going to use it in. So for example, in Adobe InDesign, if I want to place that into a document and print it and do something with it, I can just do a file place in InDesign and go into, where did I put that? Flame sign. There we go, and just place it in there and boom. There I've got that flame sign in InDesign. So Illustrator files work great. Especially Illustrator files work good if there is any partial transparency. So if you have an opacity going on that you might want to see through to other elements that might be behind that, you need to save as an Adobe Illustrator file. There is another format if you don't have partial transparency like that you might use. It's an older format. I don't really use it anymore, but let me save a copy as an EPS. I just mention it just in case somebody needs an EPS from you. It's an old format that I don't really use anymore unless somebody really needs one for some special reason. But it's what people used to save their Illustrator files as years ago, and some people are just still in the habit. But anymore, as long as you're using Adobe apps like InDesign and Photoshop, the big difference between an Adobe Illustrator file and an EPS is that Adobe Illustrator files support semi-transparency and EPSs do not. So in general, Adobe Illustrator should be fine for going to print. That's what I recommend. If you're going to the web, then in that case, this would have been in an RGB document. Now we can convert this document into RGB if we need to. Let's say we'd be in an RGB document. And let's say you want to now save this for the web. If you're going to put it into a modern web page, the normal format that we want to use now is called SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. We used to save our files as PNGs or GIFs a lot of times, but for anything that is vector, it should stay vector these days. And now browsers support native vectors in a format called SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. But you do want to remove any excess canvas you have because that would be included in the final file. So a trick for doing that. If you have an object, and maybe it's made of many things, it's a good idea to group it first if it's a bunch of things. So let me just group that. Because when I do this trick, it's going to snap to the shape of the group. Okay. Go to your artboard tool, which determines the size of the artboard that we're sitting in. And the trick is, instead of pulling this in manually, just double click on the group. It will automatically size itself to the group. Now, if you only have one element, you don't have to group it. It's just, like in this case, I technically didn't have to group it. It would have sized itself to that. But if you have lots of different things in different places, you want to have them grouped so it sizes to the group as opposed to an individual part within the group. Okay. So now I've sized my artboard to the exact size of my elements. And now I can export an SVG file. File, export, export as. We can choose our SVG file. I'm going to click export. And one thing you want to generally do in here is if you have type, you probably want to convert that to outlines most of the time, because if you leave the fonts as SVG, then it's going to require the font to be loaded in the final web page. Now, if you're already loading the font in the final web page, that might be fine. But if you don't want to have to worry about loading the font in the final web page, convert to outlines, and then you don't need to worry about special fonts being loaded in the final page. The other thing I would also do in here is uncheck responsive. Ideally, these icons are built at the size you want them to be. You uncheck responsive, and then when you bring it into the web page, it comes in at the size you built it. Now, it's still vector, so you can make it bigger or smaller as needed, and there will be no loss of quality. But by unchecking responsive, you're going to include the width and height that you built it at. The problem with checking responsive is that when you check that on, it will eliminate the width and height in the file, and there will be no width and height specified in the SVG file. And that can lead to problems in different browsers, such as Internet Explorer, or sometimes even Microsoft Edge, which is the latest Microsoft browser. Not having a built-in width and height can lead to problems in those browsers. But the other thing is that if you don't include a width and height, every time you bring it into your web page, you need to specify the width and height every time you bring it in. So if you build it at the right size and then uncheck responsive, Illustrator will code the width and height in so it will come in at the size you wanted it to be. And then only if the developer wants to make it bigger or smaller, only in that case will they override the width and height that's in the file with their own different size. But don't worry about quality because it's vector, so it can be bigger and smaller. Including a default width and height is not a problem. And that's really what unchecking responsive does, is it includes the default width and height. You can always change it in the final web page. That's okay. But if you don't include a width and height, you can lead to issues in Internet Explorer and Microsoft Edge. So I recommend unchecking responsive, click OK, and you get an SVG file. If you have the latest versions of Illustrator, you will have that file export version of saving SVGs. That will give you better, more optimized code. But if you're in an older version of Illustrator, you won't have that under export. If you have an older version of Illustrator, save a copy as an SVG. You will have the save as in older versions of Illustrator. The export is new. The export's a little bit better. You're going to get more optimized code, but the older save as will still function. So if you have the new export, use that. If you don't, still use save as. And don't do the compressed. That should be done on the server. Just do regular SVG and save it from there. Again, you have the same thing about you can convert to outlines. And in here, you have to click more options to see that responsive option that you want to uncheck. I have a question in the chat. Is the group command destructive? No, the group command is not destructive. At any point, you can ungroup it, and that's not a problem in grouping or ungrouping. Okay, so I do want to open up to questions if you have them, but just want to mention once again, if you do want to learn more about Illustrator or any of the other things that we teach, definitely check out our classes that we offer: Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, web design, all sorts of different cool stuff to learn. We have an Illustrator class, and you can attend this in person, live in New York City, or you can attend online. You'll do a screen share into the instructor's computer. You hear them on your computer speakers, or you can call in if you prefer using your phone. And it's a live online experience where it's interactive. You can talk to the instructor, and you have to attend while the class is actually operating in New York. These are all New York City times. So you can do live online or come here in person. So if you can't make it here to New York City, you can still attend our classes doing the live online option. If you can't do the class for whatever reason, you want to learn on your own, we have great workbooks, step-by-step workbooks. You can check those out as well by clicking either this link or just going up here to books. I'm right here, so I'll just click on this. And you can get them in print or an eBook. If you get the eBook, you get a printable PDF if you do want to print it yourself, but you also get a file that's an EPUB for any e-reader except for Kindle. We give you a Mobi file for Kindles, so you can read it on whatever device you want. And so you can get them in print or you can get them as ebook. So if you want to get started right away, you can download the ebook and go to it and start learning some more cool stuff. And so, yeah, the workbooks, we give them to people that take the class, but they are great standalone learning methods. We sell a lot of workbooks to people that want to do it on their own time. They can't attend the class, and they're meant to be things that you can go through on your own. They're step-by-step. They say, go to this menu, hit this keystroke, do this, and they literally walk you through doing it. We even give you, for Illustrator, we give you some like tracing templates for you to draw over to help you get the feel of drawing in Illustrator. So you know, the class is great if you can do it. Next best thing, if you can't do the class, a book is also a great way to learn. So does anyone have any questions before we wrap it up for the day? Give a minute or two for any questions in the chat. All right, looks like nobody has any additional questions. So just want to thank everybody for coming, and be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel here. You'll get notifications of videos when we post them. So this video will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel, and also any future live stream that we do is posted to the YouTube channel. Anybody that attends live, we also email you a link to the video as well, but you can always just check out our YouTube channel. All right, so thank you so much, and hope to see you in a future seminar, and thanks so much for attending. Bye, everybody.